A Russian convoy of 120 tanker vehicles was advancing along a carefully planned route. The convoy commander was convinced that the vehicles, repainted to resemble civilian tanker trucks hauling milk and water, would not raise any suspicion. However, a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone was already flying over the area, and the opposing side knew the convoy's entire route in advance. What happened next completely transformed the understanding of how warfare is conducted in the 21st century. This is not a story about superiority in manpower or in the number of tanks. It is a story about how small drones costing a few $1,000s each were able to stop a column weighing several tons, destroy fuel reserves worth millions, and disrupt the entire logistical chain of a whole region. Let us break down this engagement step by step. At 10 o'clock in the morning, local time, a column of 120 Russian tanker vehicles departed from Rostov, heading for Crimea via Mariupol. Everything had been thought through. Military vehicles repainted and camouflaged as civilian milk and water transport. The convoy commander considered the plan nearly perfect. But the Ukrainian side already knew the entire route. Above the column, the LIA-100 reconnaissance drone flew silently. Thanks to its optical camera, the operators detected a damaged bridge ahead of them. The roadway narrowed, forcing the vehicles to slow down and bunch together into a tight single file. An ideal location for an attack. The column was not carrying fuel alone. It was the vital artery supplying Russian bases, combat equipment, and defense systems in Crimea. Everything was proceeding according to plan. But exactly 3 minutes later, the hunter became the prey. Every time the LIA-100 transmitted images to the ground station, it emitted electromagnetic pulses into the air. The Russian electronic reconnaissance system began intercepting them. At first the signals appeared random, but when they repeated again and again from the same point, the picture became clear. The next generation counter-battery radar, Yastreb AW, recorded every transmission and calculated bearing lines. One line tells you nothing, but when several lines intersect at a single point, that becomes a set of coordinates. 2 minutes later, Russian artillery opened fire. The shells covered the Ukrainian drone control area. The operators realized their principal mistake. They had been transmitting from the same position for more than 5 minutes. On the modern battlefield, that is the equivalent of drawing a red cross on the enemy's map. The Russians have their own term for this. Reconnaissance by fire. There is no need to see the target. It is enough to intercept the signal, calculate the coordinates, and open fire. After the first artillery round, the Ukrainian operators understood that continuous video transmission was no longer possible. The LIA-100 drone switched to autonomous mode using artificial intelligence. The onboard algorithm independently identified the column, took control of the target, and continued tracking without constant orders from the ground. The electromagnetic signature decreased immediately. The Yastreb AW lost the stable signal source. But no sooner had the Ukrainians believed they had escaped radar detection than a new threat appeared. From the north, the Russian Orlan 30 reconnaissance drone was approaching, equipped with thermal cameras. Its mission was to locate the Ukrainian command group and transmit precise coordinates for an artillery strike. The Ukrainian team had two options: continue observing the column while risking detection, or mask their thermal signatures and temporarily lose visual contact. They chose to disappear. The equipment was switched off, the batteries and transmitters concealed, and every soldier lay flat on the ground beneath thermal blankets and camouflage netting. The ground station virtually vanished from the thermal display. But before going completely silent, the team had to transmit target designation data to the attack group positioned a few kilometers away. An ordinary radio communication would have meant two transmitters operating simultaneously, a double electromagnetic footprint, two markers on the Yastreb AW map. For this reason, a different method was used. The drone's onboard artificial intelligence compressed all the data into a tiny digital packet: GPS coordinates, column speed, wind direction, and the optimal moment for the attack. The packet was transmitted as a brief pulse on the 433 MHz frequency, a band to which Russia pays minimal attention during drone control surveillance. The entire transmission lasted half a second, too brief for the Yastreb AW to determine its origin, too well encrypted to be decoded immediately. The attack group received everything it needed for the assault. The damaged bridge forced all 120 tanker vehicles to form a single file and advance slowly over the broken concrete slabs. If a tanker truck is struck in the center of the bridge, the secondary explosions can reach the vehicles ahead and behind, turning the entire narrow crossing into a chain of fire and detonations. But Ukraine had only 8 minutes before the column cleared the bridge. At 10:35, the attack group launched the first FPV drones. Each drone carried a shaped charge warhead and had a flight endurance of 7 minutes. To the target, 5 minutes. It seemed straightforward, but the Russians would never advance such a column without cover. The first line of defense, electronic warfare. Traveling with the column was a truck equipped with the R330 Zhitel electronic warfare system. In simple terms, it is an enormous radio tower operating in reverse. Rather than connecting devices, it floods the entire area with electronic noise. The system jammed GPS, GSM, and the standard drone control frequencies. Picture this: an FPV operator tries to whisper a command through a small radio transmitter, while 1,000 loudspeakers are screaming at full volume right next to them. The signal did not disappear, it was simply that nobody could hear it. The image on the screen began to stutter. The video dropped from 60 frames per second to 15, but the FPV drones were not limited to a single frequency. Their programmable radio modules began hopping between channels and penetrating non-standard bands outside the ranges that the Zhitel was configured to block as a priority. The signal returned, blurred, with delays, unstable, but sufficient for the operators to continue maintaining control. When the group entered the zone, less than 1.5 kilometers from the bridge, the electronic warfare system increased its power. The image froze, fragmented into blocks of interference, and disappeared. Under normal circumstances, that would have meant the end of the mission, but these drones had yet another level of guidance. As soon as the connection with the pilot was severed, the onboard computer vision module activated automatically. The artificial intelligence began processing the camera image, searching for the silhouettes of the tanker vehicles, the surface of the bridge, and the narrow file of vehicles. The electronic warfare system could blind the operator, but it could not override the decision already encoded within the drone. Then the second line of defense appeared. Russian interceptor drones, light drones without warheads, were diving from above to collide with the Ukrainian FPVs and detonate their warheads. They were lighter, more maneuverable, and the dive gave them additional speed. Collisions followed in quick succession. Some Ukrainian drones were destroyed, but the Ukrainian operators quickly grasped the logic of the attack. The interceptor drones could no longer alter their dive trajectory. Either they hit their target or they crashed into the ground. When the next group of interceptor drones began their dive, the operators cut thrust completely at the last moment. Weighed down by the warhead, the FPVs dropped immediately and broke out of the collision trajectory. The Russian drones passed at over 180 kilometers per hour and smashed into the road embankment. Then the Ukrainians set a trap. A portion of the FPVs accelerated sharply towards the convoy, mimicking a final attack and drawing all the interceptor drones towards them. The second group reduced speed and hugged the ground, simulating drones with exhausted batteries. The Russians ignored them and launched themselves at the first group. 30 seconds later, the first group turned 180 degrees. The head-on collision of the two formations destroyed almost all of the interceptor drones, and the second group was advancing silently along the road embankment at less than 1 meter of altitude. The third line, infantry. Russian soldiers opened fire with assault rifles and shotguns directly at the approaching drones, attempting to raise a wall of bullets in front of the formation. 3 hits damaged FPVs. One began to tilt, another had its casing pierced, and in the third a bullet passed through the battery. The voltage began to drop, but it was precisely the chaotic flight of the damaged drones that made their trajectories unpredictable. Taking aim became even more difficult. At 10:42, the first FPV struck a tanker truck in the center of the bridge. The shaped charge warhead pierced the wall of the tank. The fuel vapors ignited. A column of fire rose into the sky. A shockwave spread across the bridge. The stricken tanker truck overturned and blocked the crossing. The second drone struck the point where several tanker trucks had bunched together in the narrow section of the bridge. The fire spread to the column within seconds. The vehicles in the center of the bridge could neither advance nor turn around. The tires burst from the heat, the fuel valves and pipes were destroyed, releasing more flammable vapors into the fire. The third FPV was nearly out of power. The artificial intelligence kept the target in its field of view until the very last moment. The motor stopped 50 meters from the bridge, but the momentum was sufficient. The drone struck a tanker truck on the side of the bridge, where the vehicles that had managed to cross had accumulated. The third explosion closed the pincer. The bridge was blocked at both ends and in the center. The column was cut to pieces. The vehicles at the front fled. The vehicles at the rear could not move. The tanker trucks on the bridge were ablaze, but the real consequences extend far beyond the burnt-out vehicles. When a fuel supply route is blocked, the entire logistical system behind it begins to unravel. Tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, and supply trucks do not receive fuel on time. Mechanized forces without fuel lose their mobility, and immobilized equipment becomes fixed targets. In Crimea, limited reserves force the prioritization of military forces and emergency services. Civilians line up at gas stations, prices rise, and the electricity supply is disrupted. This is precisely Ukraine's objective, not a direct assault on the peninsula, but the systematic destruction of roads, railway lines, and maritime corridors that progressively transforms Crimea from a military fortress into a logistically isolated enclave. Herein lies precisely the strength of asymmetric warfare. A handful of drones costing a few $1,000s destroyed fuel and equipment worth millions, stopped a convoy, blocked a bridge, and disrupted the supply of an entire region. The FPV drones did not have sufficient power to return, but it was enough to change the course of the operation. In your opinion, what was the decisive moment of this attack? The autonomous artificial intelligence, the decoy maneuver against the Interceptor drones, or the precise choice of the bottleneck at the bridge? Write your thoughts in the comments. If this type of analysis interests you, subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Until the next episode.